We're Topple Galloway.
I am Steve Topple.
And I'm George Galloway. Now, what would you make of a man who confused the nationality of his own wife? Moreover, whilst talking to one of the leaders of the country she actually comes from. Well, you thought Boris Johnson was bad. Jeremy Hunt. He made a hunt of the health service. He's making a hunt of the foreign service. He's sitting with one of the leaders of China. His wife is Chinese, Mrs. Hunt. You'd think that would be a card to play. He tells the Chinese leader, my wife's Japanese. I mean Chinese. Has he got another wife?
It wouldn't surprise. It's just staggering, isn't it? This man, honestly. I mean, I suppose politically it's quite interesting to look at because he's very much like Mr. Grayling in terms of he doesn't seem to be able
blandness.
Well, he's bland.
Grey.
He's bland, but he's one of these Tories, which is like a very bad smell, like they all are. But he's a particular stink in the same mould as Grayling. That the cabinet and the leaders of the Conservative Party don't seem to want to get rid of him. So he's sort of gone past the Cameron era, and he stayed central to the May era as well, even though he must be one of the most bumbling, incompetent, and nefarious politicians of recent times.
Well, you'd think so. I mean, he is the turd that doesn't flush. That's for sure. Every time there's a reshuffle, a reflush, he's still bobbing around.
He's the something that rises to the top.
Yes. Now he was the longest serving health secretary of all time. Now the health area is your bag. How did he do at that?
There's not enough expletives in the English language to say how he did on that. I mean, it was appalling. He encapsulated this dogmatic conservative notion that we can fool the public into thinking we care about the health service while stealthily privatising it. It was an absolute disaster, from the imposition of the junior doctors contract against all negative responses from both the profession and their representatives and trade unions, to overseeing the longest increase in waiting times for years. He was just a disaster, and yet the Conservatives kept him in that position, I think because he was so dogmatic about the underlying agenda that the Tories have for the National Health Service. But just one more point. I find him fascinating, and in the same way as Grayling, because he's not of that David Cameron clique where they're all old Etonians and up to their necks in the banking industry, if you like. But then he's not really Theresa May's sort of old chums from university, as she was with much of her original cabinet, I should say.
Yeah, most of them now gone.
They have now gone, yes. The sort of likes of Damien Green, who she went to university with. He's none of those things, but that's why I say he's in the same mould as Grayling. He is one of these turds that they can't seem to flush.
An eminence Greece. He has always been forgetful, of course, so maybe the wife issue it runs out of the same stable of him forgetting to register that he's the owner of a very significant number of very expensive properties.
Indeed.
From which he draws rent.
Oh, but look, I mean, he used to be very high up in the jam world, didn't he? He was responsible for exporting jam, and also he ran.
Thank God! I thought you meant Paul Weller for a minute. I didn't see him as a late punk rocker.
And he also ran an educational company. But I mean, like you quite rightly said in your opening, if you thought Boris Johnson was bad, I mean, it was Foreign Secretary. I was literally quite taken aback when they made that decision.
I was. Although you'd be amazed, there are people in Westminster who think he could possibly be the next Prime Minister. It's quite frightening, the lack of talent on the Conservative front bench, don't you think?
It is, no, absolutely. I mean, and she literally is running out of options completely. And Hampton, I mean, the fact she brought back Excellent McVeigh says a lot as well. But yeah, it is staggering. And I can't even use the Cockney rhyming slam for Jeremy Hunt because Berkshire Hunt is, of course, his surname anyway.
But Mrs. Hunt, we love you. Yes. And we will never forget that you are Chinese.
So, as we are filming, elections are underway in Zimbabwe. You have the president, Mnangagwa, of the ruling ZANU-PF party, up against a guy called Mr. Chamisa from the opposition MDC party. Polling saying it's very close, and this is being trumpeted as one of the most democratic elections in the country's history. You've got people from the EU and the US, believe it or not, overseeing the elections. Phil's moving confidence, George. But of course, sensationally, on Sunday, you had former president and man who was overthrown in the coup last November, Robert Mugabe, coming out saying he wasn't supporting the incumbent president. He was going for the opposition guy. George,
well, amazing.
It sounds like all a bit of a mess.
Well, I know Mnangagwa. I knew him when he was a minister in Mugabe's government. I've met Mugabe several times. Unlike Prince Charles, I'm not claiming I shook his hand in the dark and didn't know who he was, for younger viewers. I admired the role that Mugabe played in the liberation of Zimbabwe from white colonial rule. It's important to remember that before Mugabe, only white people could vote. Black people were hewers of wood and drawers of water, and they had to wade through rivers of their own people's blood in order to overthrow what was apartheid in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it used to be called. If you want to go further back to how the land came to be called Rhodesia, was of course the brigand, the pirate, Cecil Rhodes, who just rode in and literally stole it from the African people who lived there. So I've never been comfortable with the propaganda against Mugabe, even though of course I freely acknowledge that it would have been far better for him and for the people if he'd bowed out long before he was forced to depart the stage. Mnangagwa was, if you like, the Stalin to Mugabe's Lenin. He was the man who knows where all the bodies are buried. He is was responsible for security in the country. It was effectively a one-party state, as most countries coming out of liberation are. I personally would be supporting ZANU-PF, maybe mainly for old time's sake. The way I look at it, Steve, is I look at who's supporting the opposition. I look at who all these observers you mentioned are coming there to try and ensure that they get the gig. And I usually say I'm probably on the other side from them.
Now, you see, I generally kind of agree with you on that notion. It usually works fairly well, doesn't it? Whoever our lot are supporting, then we need to go in the opposite direction. And of course, I mean, I agree with you, everything you said about sort of the end of colonialism that Mugabe overthrew. Alarm bells when I read through the history books, which I don't always trust, but when I do read through them, alarm bells start to ring with the fact that Thatcher seems sort of fairly overtly supportive sometimes of Mugabe. And there's no denying, as you quite rightly said, that he should have been ousted years before. My concern with these elections is, from my little knowledge, I'm no expert on Zimbabwe, I'm not saying I am, but from my little knowledge, it's like picking the sort of best out of a barrel of rotten apples.
Well,
maybe
to
because who
who
is really? I mean, who is really looking after the best interests of Zimbabwe here? Both of the candidates have come out and said they're looking for foreign investment, which again, alarm bells ring for me straight away when anyone says that, because there are very few countries left in the world who are outriders against sort of Western imperialism and Western corrupt capitalism. And as soon as someone says, in the same way we talked about Venezuela a few weeks ago, and as soon as someone says foreign investment, alarm bells start to ring for me. And also with regards to these actual elections, while they're saying that, well, they're democratic and free and what have you, blah, 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 there was a swathe of laws passed just in May this year, I was reading, a lot of which was cracking down on the right to assembly and the right to free speech running up to these elections. I mean, the military have been very quiet during this, and they said they're keeping a hands-off approach, which I think is fair to say they have done, because reports coming out are saying that they've been mostly peaceful, these elections, and the turnout has been high. I don't know if it's my idealist values and my young rose-tinted glasses.
You're young and idealistic. I'm less young and now less idealistic, but I get where you're coming from. If you want a rubric, and you have to go back to the mists of the Cold War. The reason that Mrs. Thatcher wanted Mugabe is because she wasn't Joshua Nkomo. Joshua Nkomo was the very big, heavy fellow who led the rival organization to Mugabe's. He was pro-Moscow. He was regarded as the Soviet man in Zimbabwe, whereas Mugabe was not. He was close to China, but then the West had very high hopes of a different kind of China then. So it's true what you say. She was sanguine about him coming to power because he wasn't Joshua Nkomo. Now, Mnangagwa wants foreign investment, yes, but he wants to keep Zimbabwe's special relationship with China. So you'll get a lot of Chinese capital investment in Zimbabwe if Mnangagwa wins. You'll get a lot of hope for a lot of Western investment if the opposition party wins.
That's very
China
obvious,
will be edged out, pushed out. And there's another regional issue. ZANU-PF are naturally very close to the ANC in South Africa because the ANC and ZANU-PF were fighting white colonial rule as comrades in arms. So ZANU-PF are very close to Cyril Ramaphosa and the government in South Africa. The opposition are not. So looked at geopolitically, I say that Mnangagwa is of the two, the anti-imperialist candidate. He's the candidate that will least open the country to the IMF, the World Bank, and the depredations of Western capitalist investment.
I think it's a very interesting comment, and I'm going to look into that more. I think for me, these elections, though, sum up how the hangover of colonialism, if you like, is still felt to this day.
Sure,
within Africa.
I mean, it's only yesterday. It's in the life of a man, it's a long time. But historically speaking, it's only yesterday
blink of an
that
eye,
Zimbabwe became free.
Yeah,
I remember Stevie Wonder singing about it in Hotter Than July. Peace has come to Zimbabwe. And it was a long and bloody war to get there.
Indeed. Moving on to another elections, and this I know nothing about. So this is Steve Topple being educated by George, episode 2.
Well,
talk to me about Cambodia.
You know, they're not entirely separate issues. It is a tale of two elections, but Cambodia now has run its election. The Prime Minister, Hun Sen, has won. The West is up in arms about it. I just listened on my own radio station, talk radio, to one of my colleagues interviewing an expert, not so expert she knew how to pronounce Phnom Penh, which is the capital of
How did she pronounce it?
Phnom Penh.
Oh, Phnom.
But she was an expert.
Sounds like
she was expert enough to know that Hun Sen is a pro-Vietnam, pro-China dictator, and that he'd almost certainly stolen the election. Now, I've been there before. I was, believe it or not, the head election observer more than 20 years ago in the elections in Cambodia. And I was the head of all these observers who came from all these Western countries and agencies. And they came with no other purpose than to try and help bring down Hun Sen. And from the coverage of this election, it's clear that they're still trying to do so. Now, I heard on this radio interview I'm telling you about, the woman actually say these words. When Jamie East, my colleague, said, well, what can we do about all this cheating? He doesn't know that we no longer rule Southeast Asia. What can we do? And she answered, well, only the US can do anything at all. Without the US, Cambodia is crippled. Now, with the caveat that she's probably aged 17 and a half, otherwise she'd know how to pronounce Phnom Penh, and Jamie East is a younger man too, neither appeared to know. Crippled? Millions of Cambodians were murdered thanks to the US, directly by Kissinger and Nixon, bombing it, napalm, Agent Orange, Rolling Thunder. They laid waste to Cambodia and literally killed millions of people and crippled quite a few more Ahed warrant. And then they supported Pol Pot, the genocidal maniac who killed about half of Cambodia. And he was backed by Britain and the United States, even after Hun Sen, admittedly on top of a Vietnamese tank, had overthrown Pol Pot. We continued to endorse Pol Pot sitting in the United Nations years after Hun Sen overthrew him in the military intervention led by Vietnam.
Okay, so just on that note then, with these elections, how much influence do you think has actually been exerted from the West, if you like, and how much of an effect
well,
do you think it's
when you
had?
bring these observers in, you know, there's a Vietnamese saying, when you open the doors and the windows, the flies come in. And if I were running a poor third world country, I'm not sure I'd be queuing up for these observers, because I know the kind of people they are. When I was the head election observer, I spent every day and night fighting with all the other election observers who wanted to cry foul, this is cheating, this opposition politician is not getting enough time on the television, and so on. Even though this was a country that literally arose from the ashes of the Pol Pot genocidal era. They were looking for, I don't know, the standards of an American presidential election in the Cambodian polity. It's an absurd set of, I think, very patronizing and colonialistic attitudes. Look, I don't know how much Hun Sen's support really is. I don't know anything about the opposition. What I do know is it's not really our business. Our business is to allow the Cambodians, one way or another, to build their own future. And I know that these observers and international organizations don't have the interests of the Cambodian people at heart. If they had, they wouldn't have supported Pol Pot for years after he'd been overthrown. No,
this is very true. I think you made a really important point there, actually, which kind of references back to the situation with Zimbabwe as well, that with a Western mindset, if you like, and sort of the Western imperialist powers, after decades of colonial rule, and as you say in Cambodia, the situation with Pol Pot, that suddenly we miraculously expect them to be all westernised and democratic.
Yeah, they want it to be like a parish council in Wimbledon.
Yeah, and often that same kind of argument is used about Russia as well, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
That suddenly they, just because they're no longer ruled by A, B and C, but they have to suddenly conform to our standards, and it has to happen overnight. It's quite a sort of fascinating, stupid argument.
This
really.
radio interview really took me back. Glenys Kinnock was one of the people operating under me in that election, and I promise you, she did not spare any effort to try and create the international mood music to delegitimize the Hun Sen government. I was the only supporter of Hun Sen in Phnom Penh, in the Foreign Correspondents Club at that time. Mind you, Jeremy Hunt's wife's Cambodian, isn't she?
Is she Cambodian? I thought she was Zimbabwean. Who knows? Elections, hey? The lobotomized areas of social media have been awash the past day or two with the news that the Obamas were caught bopping and shimmying and grinding and twerking at a Jay Z and Beyonce concert in Maryland. The kind of images that conjures up are for another time, possibly, or for a place on the dark internet, maybe. However... There's a really sort of worrying undertone with all this, the fact that the Obamas are so closely tied with the likes of Jay Z and Beyonce, George. It worries me greatly as someone who grew up with hip-hop music. My dad was a jazz musician, and I grew up with jazz all around me, but I made sort of a natural progression to hip-hop and rap when I was sort of 12, 13, because at the time it was very kind of underground, very working class, very civil rights led music. And now we have one of the most dangerous, the most warmongering presidents in US history being endorsed by a rapper who was at the forefront of the black civil rights rap movement of the 1990s. It's almost as if these people have sold out. What's your take on this? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I know little of the hip hop genre. It's before my time, but the phenomenon you mention is a real and quite sinister one. As Harold Wilson would put it, what's going on? She's going on. Michelle Obama is off and running with a preparatory committee to run for president of the United States against Donald Trump. I know you couldn't make this up. Are there any more than a few families in the United States? Do their wives, husbands, daughters all have to fill all the top positions in the state? But I spoke recently to a right-wing, kind of Trumpist American the other day, who confessed to me that the only Democratic Party candidate that Donald Trump fears is Michelle Obama.
Oh, okay.
Now, what conceivable qualifications she would have to be the President of the United States, I don't know. But then Donald Trump didn't either.
Well,
she's at least as qualified, you might say, therefore, as Donald Trump, a reality TV star and a property mogul, not nearly as rich as he liked to pretend to us that he was. So it is amazing that Obama, who, as we've often discussed, laid waste to people of color, mainly, in fact, almost always, in their bombing and droning and rocketing attacks. They did nothing to end the situation where black people in the United States are much more likely to be in prison than in university, where white cops killing black people on the streets gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, and Obama either couldn't or wouldn't, maybe both, do anything at all about it. And now they're black heroes. They're black heroes because a multi-millionaire, what's his name, Jay Z?
Jay Z.
Jay Z, Jay Z is Jeremy Corbyn. Jay Z has endorsed him, or rather endorsed her.
Exactly. I mean, it's quite sad for me because I think Jay Z is an extremely talented musician, but it really undermines and underscores for me what's happened to that genre of music. I agree, by the way, with you about Michelle Obama. It's blatantly obvious they're priming her to be the Democratic candidate. Absolutely, but
well, the kids are missing the White House, you know.
Yeah, of course, exactly. They're missing the lawn, aren't they? Yes.
Yeah.
But no, it underscores what's happened to hip hop because Jay Z.
But doesn't it contrast with another people
well, it
you
does.
like, Kanye West?
This is fascinating.
Kanye West is with the right wing outsider.
He is, yeah. And if you look at their individual histories, Jay Z, rapper, grew up in the projects in New York. Kanye West, middle class family, and Kanye West has suddenly gone the anti-establishment person fighting for the underdog, or so he claims, in Donald Trump. And yet Jay Z's gone with the more warmongering, liberal, not everything he makes out to be Obama. And like I say, it underscores a complete betrayal of where he came from, because his movement and what he was part of, Jay Z, in the 90s was vehemently anti-establishment. There was you must have heard of the rapper Notorious B.I.G.
Yes.
Yes. One of his final songs before he was murdered was a song called Notorious Thugs, and it was rallying against the American establishment, who had put everything into the recovery after the Great Recession, put everything into the recovery of the white and black middle classes, and it abandons the black working classes of America. And Jay Z came from this movement, and yet he's now endorsing a president who did absolutely nothing to further the lives of black working class Americans at all. And it's a shame he's sold out.
Ever since Barack Obama broke into song, a change is going to come, I think, as Sam Cooke. A change is going to come.
Really?
And there was no change, except change for the worse.
Exactly.
And now they want to do it all again with the wife. She's not Chinese, is she?
I think she's Cambodian.
The BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa were meeting in Cape Town in South Africa over the last few days. I'm telling you that because you definitely didn't know it. You didn't know it, at least if you were dependent on the mainstream media. this endless infatuation with the failing European Union managed to miss a gathering of the biggest, most important, and by and large, fastest rising economies in the world. That in itself is scandalously ill-reported. But there's a new kid on the block, Steve.
There is.
President Erdogan wants to put a T in BRICS. He wants Turkey to join the BRICS. Now, Turkey is a big and powerful economy that has been looking west for decades, hoping to get into the European Union. This looks like Turkey's decided that its future lies to its east and to its south.
It is,
quite
isn't
significant.
it? It is. To be honest, I can't keep up with Turkey because, like you quite rightly point out, just up until it might have been last year, Turkey was pushing and pushing and pushing to join the European Union from a viewpoint where the European Union was going,
Muslims.
very.
We don't want to put an M in the EU.
No, exactly. And now suddenly we've had this development, and it's fascinating because, as you quite rightly point out, the Western media has largely ignored the BRICS conference, which in itself is interesting, considering Brexit's supposed to be about us trading with the rest of the world.
Rejoining the world, yeah.
Rejoining the world and trading with the likes of India.
We should have had somebody at the BRICS conference. We should have had a minister there. Jeremy Hunt and his Cambodian wife could have
his
gone.
His wife's Zimbabwean, we've told you before. It's ridiculous, and on another point completely, it contradicts the whole Brexit argument. That they didn't send anyone there. But no, it's a fascinating position of Turkey, not at least geopolitically. If they do ascend into BRICS, if you like, it's going to put the cat right amongst the pigeons in terms of Europe's relationship with not only Russia but the Middle East, to have the country smack bang in the middle of all those areas: Asia, Middle East, Europe, Russia, a member of BRICS.
Well, that's right, and it foreshadows something that is almost certainly underway, which is that Turkey is aligning itself with Russia and with Iran, which means it's aligning itself against Saudi Arabia and the United States, whilst remaining a member of NATO and having a measure of veto on NATO activity, by the way. I mean, I'm always arguing we should pull out of NATO, but you could equally argue we should stay in NATO and throw a spanner in its works.
No, very true,
A Corbyn government could say, nah, don't fancy that war.
Exactly, destroy it from within.
They could stop it.
Yeah.
So Turkey is facing both ways still, of course, to be sure, but it seems to be making a strategic choice to go one way rather than the other.
It does. What is also interesting for me, though, is that Erdogan is he to be trusted, though?
Are any of them?
Well, no, they're not. Of course, don't trust any
we
of
mustn't,
them.
we mustn't place unrealistic
we wouldn't.
demands on him.
Quite.
But if you've got to be straight, honest and true, Honest Abe died in that theatre that day.
Well, yes, but can he be trusted, and should Russia and especially China, to be honest, should they be trusting him if they bring him in? Because, I mean, the thing, it's downplayed, it's constantly downplayed, but we can see the manoeuvres, and we've been seeing it for goodness knows how many years, of China gradually becoming the world's largest economy. We've also seen them moving towards a bit more of a Western model, with them opening up their stock markets to the Western ones, and mass layoff of public sector jobs over the past couple of years, and that are still to come. Is moving Turkey into that sort of conglomerate of countries really the wisest move on their behalf?
Well, Turkey, until a few years ago, was growing faster than China. In the period that Erdogan, about whom I could say many bad things, don't get me wrong, but in the period of Erdogan, the economy has grown by 150%. So everyone is 1.5 times richer in Turkey than they were when he came to power. Turkey occupies a very strategic space with a reach into the Arab world, a reach into Asia, on the cusp of Europe, and now looking south to Iran, to India, to its east, and so on. These, our children, certainly our grandchildren, will live in a world where the BRICS countries are the important countries and the EU countries and museums. Trust me on that.
Very true. The E who? And that's it.
My Zimbabwean wife's about to make me some nice goat stew.
Yes.
It's been marvellous. We've been Topple Galloway.
We have. And as always, don't forget you can get in touch with us. If you're not sure of your wife's nationality, you can get in touch with us on Twitter.
We'll tell you.
We'll help you out. Work out if she's Chinese, Japanese, Cambodian or Zimbabwean. Get in touch with us on Twitter with your suggestions, your problems with your wives. It's at Mr. Topple and at George Galloway. But until next week, take care of yourselves.
Just one more thing. Ahed Tamimi, the young Palestinian Joan of Arc, has finally been released after 8 months in confinement in an Israeli dungeon where she was threatened by Israeli politicians of something dreadful happening to her in the dark. By imprisoning Ahed Tamimi, this beautiful young Palestinian hero, the Israelis scored a very big own goal. They drew attention to what Palestinians looked like, and they didn't look like what the mass media would like them to look like. But more important, it's vital not to claim that Ahed Tamimi is free. She is not free. She is merely out of prison. She remains incarcerated in the occupied Palestinian lands along with millions of her compatriots.
Just one more thing. On Sunday, the government announced the extension of the Blue Badge parking scheme for disabled people. It's now rolling out this policy and the right for disabled people to have free parking for a certain amount of time in certain places to autistic people, people living with mental health conditions, and people living with dementia, among other things. I have two major issues with this. Firstly, that our complicit, servitudal, forelock-tugging media promoted this story as if it was new, as if it was a massive policy shift and that the governments were helping disabled people and giving these people a benefit. The reality of this story actually was the bloody government took these blue badges away from the exact same groups of people in the first place in 2014. And all they were doing was giving these people their badges back, which they nicked off them 4 years ago. For the media to parrot this as some sort of victory for disabled people shows how utterly useless they are.